the book of Joshua in its relationship to the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the Deuteronomistic history, what comes later, the Judges through Second Kings, the relationship Joshua has to those collection of texts has been a source of debate for a long time. So some people have preferred to think of Joshua as sort of the conclusion of the Pentateuch, so thinking about it as a hexateuch, so that's a collection of 6 books rather than a Pentateuch. So Joshua has occupied sort of a hinge position in these 2 major collections, and yeah, its relationship is still debated today. But by and large, I think most scholars today consider it to be part of what's called the Deuteronomistic history, this sort of collection of historiographic books: Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. So, being the first part in the narrative sort of sequence of those sort of historiographic texts.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Kyle Rouse. We're going to be discussing a Journal of Biblical Literature article that he wrote about the Mount Ebal episode in the book of Joshua and its placement there. There's a lot of details. Articles are usually about 20 pages long. There's a lot of details in this one, and there's a lot of threads to follow. So it was a fun conversation. Before we get to that, though, today, if you're listening to this the day that it was released, is my son's 18th birthday. And I asked him if I could record a happy birthday message, and he requested in response that he be able to do his own recording. So what's going to follow here immediately before the interview actually begins is my son Ewan saying whatever. I don't know what he's saying. As of recording this, he's just recorded it. I was in the other room, and now I'm recording my intro and outro. I will know when I edit it what it says, but I love you. Happy birthday. So without further ado, here's the absolute best, Ewan Thomason.
Hey everybody, this is Ewan Thomason, son of Jared Thomason, obviously. I just wanted to say, because by the time you all will be hearing this, it will be my birthday, February 26th. I just wanted to say, I'm very proud of you, Dad. I've seen this podcast go from not having any listeners, because it didn't exist, obviously, and seeing you have a dream. And I saw that dream become what your podcast is today. And while I know you want those numbers to get higher and higher, we all want to optimize as much as possible. I just want to say I'm very proud of you. I consider your podcast a huge success. I'm really excited to see how this podcast transforms in the future. And I wanted to say to everyone who listens to this podcast, thank you for listening to my dad's podcast. It really means a lot to him. He loves his creation. He considers it a huge success, I can tell, because he's just so proud of his work. So I'm proud of you, Dad, and happy birthday to me, obviously. And I believe the next day after this releases, it will be Kyle Rouse's birthday. So happy birthday, Kyle Rouse.
Kyle Rouse, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Kyle Rouse. I'm a current PhD candidate at Baylor University in the religion department in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible subfield. I am writing a dissertation under the supervision of Joel Burnett, and the dissertation topic concerns ritual texts in the Pentateuch and ritual texts from ancient Ugarit. But we're discussing today a recent article in the Journal of Biblical Literature, which I'm really excited to talk about.
And that article is Conquests Need Monuments and Monuments Need Inscriptions, the textual location of the Mount Ebal altar episode in Joshua. Did I get that? Is it Ebal? Did I say that right?
Ebal, that's right. You got the mouthful title just right. Yeah.
No, I love it. I mean, you've already started out with like a really good word count. So.
Oh yeah, that's right. I'm just padding the article with the title.
Yeah.
I did have to cut it down. The editors suggested I take out a few words from the original I think it was the subtitle was something like the textual location of the Mount Ebal altar episode within the various text traditions or something like that. So
I love that.
anyway,
Like some Jonathan Swift, part 3, wherein I.
exactly. Uh-huh.
Okay. So jumping into the article, first question I sent you: what is the significance of the similarities between narrated conquest of Ai in the biblical story and Neo-Assyrian inscriptions? And am I saying that? Is it AI or I?
Oh, good question. You got it right. It's I. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool.
It's just the Hebrew word that means ruin. But yeah, just pronounced I. Yeah, I think there are there's a lot of significance to the similarities between the I conquest and Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions. One of the I think one of the broad pieces of significance is that the similarities speak to shared cultural conventions of narrating military conquest. So the Neo-Assyrian inscriptions I draw from are from the 9th century, so sometime in the 800s BCE, and it's striking that there's such similarities between Ashurnazarpal II's royal annals in Joshua chapter 8. So some broad cultural similarities that are also shared in some Levantine inscriptions. So things from Sabia and things from Moab, particularly the Mesha inscription. Uh, but for the article that I wrote, I think these similarities have some significance for how we think about the placement of the Mount Ebal altar episode in our various text traditions of Joshua. So we have two main Hebrew traditions. We have the Masoretic text, and then we have Qumran tradition, 4Q Joshua A, and then we have various Greek traditions, which we sort of refer to under the broad title LXX or Septuagint. So the Mount Ebal episode appears in different locations between the Masoretic text, Qumran text, and our Greek traditions. And so I think that these similarities between Neo-Assyrian inscriptions help us sort of figure out what's maybe the earliest location of that episode.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you jumped into some later questions.
I did.
You
They all wrap together. I
you
thought.
really were prepared. Um, so you focus on, and that was the first thing I noticed reading it is, so the first words of the actual article are Joshua 8 1 through 35, and then you've got a parenthetical MT for Masoretic text. So that's where you end up, I guess, not landing, but I guess your evaluation of Masoretic, Qumran, and
Mhm.
Septuagint, you've said this is where I'm landing is Masoretic is the earliest.
That's right. That's right. And maybe it would help listeners to just describe where that episode lands in the book of Joshua more broadly. So the conquest of Ai is in Joshua chapter 8, and it's narrated in verses 1 through 29. And then in the Masoretic text, what are verses 30 through 35, there's an episode where Joshua builds an altar on Mount Ebal. And in the altar, or on the altar, he writes the Torah of the law, the Torah of Yahweh upon the altar stones, and fulfills these prescriptions in Deuteronomy 27. Uh, but in the Greek tradition, that text, the episode is located 2 verses later, after what is Joshua 9 verse 2. So there's a coalition of kings that sort of interrupts the narrative sequence between this conquest of Ai and then the Mount Ebal altar episode. It's really strange if you read it in the Septuagint tradition. It just totally, I think, jostles you about where are we? We were at Ai, now there's a coalition of kings, now we're at Ebal, and then we have this Gibeon episode later. But then in the Qumran tradition, this Mount Ebal episode is located in chapter 5, which is very different from the LXX and the MT traditions. So, yeah, my argument is that the Masoretic text is the earliest, I call it the extant location, just meaning that's of the things that we have. That's the earliest location of the episode.
So I think for listeners, they'll probably be familiar: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then you get Joshua,
Let me
Judges,
get
right?
Joshua Judges. Mm-hmm.
So it is hard for me to depart from that way of thinking. So how is it? where is authorship in all of this? Should I
Oh,
understand it in that way, in that kind of order?
that's a really good question. Uh, the book of Joshua in its relationship to the Pentateuch, those first five books of the Old Testament, and the Deuteronomistic history, what comes later, the Judges through Second Kings, the relationship Joshua has to those collection of texts has been a source of debate for a long time. So some people have preferred to think of Joshua as sort of the conclusion of the Pentateuch, so thinking about it as a hexateuch, so that's a collection of six books rather than a Pentateuch. So Joshua has occupied sort of a hinge position in these two major collections, and yeah, its relationship is still debated today. But by and large, I think most scholars today consider it to be part of what's called the Deuteronomistic history, this sort of collection of historiographic books: Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. So yeah, being the first part in the narrative sort of sequence of those sort of historiographic texts. Uh, as far as authorship is concerned, it's just so difficult to say anything about who wrote particular texts of the Old Testament. Traditionally, the authorship of the Pentateuch is ascribed to Moses, but nobody that I know thinks that Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. Um, as in part of modern discourse about Joshua and its relationship to Deuteronomy. It seems to have been written sometime after Deuteronomy. A lot of Joshua assumes Deuteronomic material. So possibly Deuteronomy was written sometime in the reign of Josiah, so sometime in the late 600s or so, which means Joshua has to have been the parts of Joshua that assume Deuteronomy have to have been written after that. But people debate about what the various stages of composition, when that is, whether it's exilic, post-exilic, or even sometime in the late monarchy. So it's difficult to pinpoint even when the text of Joshua was written.
Are there questions around its origin that may be more helpful? Like where did it come from? I'm asking
Yeah, I
because
know.
the Deuteronomy thing came up, and so I knew that Deuteronom
Oh
Deuteronomistic
yeah, the big word.
Deuteronomistic. It's not that it's a big word. I don't know. My thinker and my talker aren't working well today.
Yeah.
But a second law interpretive scheme, maybe, of history
Mm.
comes in kind of late. Does that include Deuteronomy, or is that name just similar to?
Oh, the you're referring to the name of the book of
Yes.
Deuteronomy being the
Yeah.
second law. Yeah, Deuteronomy seems to be written later than probably the covenant code in Exodus. So it represents the second legal tradition, or probably second major legal tradition of the Pentateuch. Yeah, a sort of retelling or recasting of the covenant code and related material in Exodus for a new generation, narratively of Israelites. We do, of course, have another legal code in the Pentateuch, the Holiness Code, and the relationship of it to Deuteronomy has been debated, but most scholars think it's probably a late post-exilic composition. But yeah, so it's all the relationship of these texts to one another is very interesting, but also very complicated because we don't have any obvious cues in the text that say here's where one section begins that was written in the 6th century. Here's another section that begins that was written in the 5th century. So scholars will puzzle through different clues within the narrative to determine what they think is earlier or later, but almost certainly uh, Deuteronomy is earlier than this, especially this text of Joshua that the article concerns. Uh, uh, Mostly because you see this because in the text of Joshua 8, uh, the conclusion of the Mount Ebal altar episode refers to the text of Deuteronomy 27. Joshua does all of the things just as Moses commanded in the law. So at least that relationship is a little more certain. Um, I think I missed your question about where the texts were written, uh, and that's also really difficult to know. Uh, there's pretty much two places that text production take place. We think probably in temples or in palaces. They're the only places that can sustain sort of a writing center, uh, and so some people have thought that's what we have in our biblical texts. We have some sort of scribal schools that are centered around the temple in the palace. And then that gets complicated in the exilic period, where there's no more temple in Jerusalem, and so writing centers are negotiated. Where are these texts produced? Are they copied from archives that are preserved from the monarchic period? So those are all sources of debate in current scholarship.
And I hope, please let me know, and I'll get back on track if I have to. I hope that this isn't getting too far afield. I
No, this is great.
but there so well, but even copying isn't so simple as copying. It's
Right.
not like me copying your homework, which is absolutely the direction that would go. Um,
I
uh,
know.
yeah, I know we both have glasses, but
Uh,
like
no,
it's
but mine are clear. Yeah, your listeners can't see that. I have a
uh,
yeah.
so well, okay. I guess so. I'm remembering back to a conversation with Hananel Shapira, and
Okay.
he said so. Masoretic text is a reference to the notes, the marginal notes, right? The Masorah.
Oh, the Masorah in the Masoretic texts are generally the marginal notes. Yes.
Is
Good
is that
question.
additional or amplifying information, or is that sometimes part of the body of the text? Because I know scribes would put
Okay.
things in margins that would get worked in, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Good question. So the Masoretic text, by and large, refers to texts copied within the medieval Masoretic period or Masoretic tradition. Um, the Masoretes are responsible for marginal notations, but also supplying vowels to the consonantal text of Hebrew. And so when we refer to the Masoretic text, you could refer to the marginal notes or just the Masoretic vocalization of the consonantal Hebrew. In my article, all I'm doing is looking at the actual Hebrew text of the main text of of the Masoretic Joshua. I have not I didn't include notes about the Masorah at all.
Yeah, no, and just for listeners, there was nothing in his article about that. I think I'm just trying to collect as much information on the way because you're essentially talking about what it seems in this article is so the similarities between the conquest narrative here in Joshua
Mhm.
and Neo-Assyrian inscriptions. So I guess I just wanted to kind of establish a baseline understanding of the biblical text that we're talking about.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if mimic or reappropriate
Hmm.
what is the right word that you might use to
Oh,
describe these similarities.
yeah, for how biblical texts are drawing from maybe Neo-Assyrian tradition. That's a good question. Maybe um, it just seems like it's a convention of narrated conquest. So uh, it just seems to me, especially drawing from Neo-Assyrian traditions, that sort of a conquest account that begins with a divine blessing, uh, intimates or describes the destruction of a city and the humiliation of the leaders of the city, and then concludes with the um, with the building of an inscribed monument. It seems like that's just sort of a standard pattern, especially in the Neo-Assyrian tradition. And then you see that pop up in Levantine inscriptions. Uh, so I don't think that Joshua 8 is drawing directly from any one Neo-Assyrian inscription particularly. So I don't think there's a so-called genetic connection between Ashurnazar Paul II's campaign reports and Joshua 8. It seems like the author of Joshua 8 is just making use of these sort of broad cultural conventions that sort of would have been in the air, as it were. Probably though had knowledge of, or almost certainly had knowledge of these literary inscription traditions.
Okay, so it may not have been a conscious thing.
It might not have been a conscious thing in terms of the the author might not have been thinking, I've got to make sure that the text of Joshua 8 aligns with this one particular conquest account. But in constructing a conquest account, the author would have probably had in mind a certain order to present events, or would have had in mind how to describe certain kinds of events, or what details to include as a part of a conquest narrative. And those would have been drawn from these sort of, I think, larger cultural conceptions or broader cultural conceptions of how do you narrate military conquest.
Okay.
Mhm.
That's okay. So, convention is that's helpful. I think maybe then I went into it with a misunderstanding. I was just assuming that there was a like a specific intended attempt to maybe create a new narrative or approach, and by imitating the way that yeah, okay.
I see. Oh, well, I mean, you raise a good point. So the author of Joshua 8 does not include everything that is included in every single Neo-Assyrian narration of war. It doesn't include everything that's included in the Mesha inscription. So the author of Joshua 8 is certainly doing something different, or it's doing something uh, to fit his own theological or political context. And so, yeah, drawing from sort of these broad narrative conventions, but also doing something distinct. So I think that maybe the most distinct thing that the author of Joshua 8 does is the monumental inscription at the end of Joshua 8 is an altar to Yahweh, and the text that's inscribed is the Torah of Moses. That's very different from Neo-Assyrian inscriptions, where the inscription or the stela would have been erected with an image of the conquering king, and then the text describes the conquest. And so it sort of uh, reifies, or it sort of erects the sort of this constancy of the conquest of the king. But in the Ebal episode, it's this is a cultic object to Yahweh inscribed with the Torah of Moses. So it's the Torah of Moses is what has this lasting presence in the Mount Ebal episode. So different than narrating the past conquest of military conquest.
And so, not just considering Neo-Assyrians, although if you want to limit it to that, that's fine. But are there adjacent cultures where a similar legal text or code is kind of the like this is the unifying thing, or like is it always a ruler and this is the one exception?
Oh, good, yeah, good question. In certain contexts, legal codes are definitely sort of uh, they occupy sort of a central cultural binding force. There are Assyrian Ade traditions that Deuteronomy itself seems to be patterned after, um, and so that does occupy a central role in maintaining cultural identity and reinforcing social hierarchies. But uh, for conquest narratives, I do think that as far as what I've seen, it is it's unique that a law code like the Torah of Moses is inscribed at the end of military conquest. From what I've seen, we have in our Levantine inscriptions uh, a cultic installation. In the Mesha inscription, we have a narration of Mesha's conquest. And then in Neo-Assyrian traditions, it's a narration of past conquest. So legal text or legal traditions aren't prominent in those inscribed monuments.
But I mean, I suppose you could say that the law in this case is a cultic initiation, or maybe that's not the right word.
It's
Initiation.
Yeah, in this text, uh, it is combined with a cultic installation, which is very interesting, um, especially since it's very interesting, especially since uh, a part of the Deuteronomic law code is cultic centralization, and so an altar at Mount Ebal is interesting within the Deuteronomic the Deuteronomistic history tradition. But yeah, very interesting that the legal code of the Torah of Moses is paired with this cultic installation.
I,
Certainly.
that's the word I was looking for. Again, my thinker and my talker. What do you mean cultic centralization?
Oh goodness. So this is just one of the key themes of the book of Deuteronomy is centralization of worship. That worship to Yahweh is supposed to be done in one location. So this speaks to probably an established monarchy in the south, in Judah, where people are meant to be worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. So different than, say, the holiness code that allows animal slaughter outside of a central location. Uh, that also speaks to probably a post-exilic context where there's not a central location of worship. Um, but the text of Joshua 8 narratively takes place before the people have arrived in Jerusalem. So a cult center outside of Jerusalem isn't narratively problematic. Uh, but for the Deuteronomic Law Code, it is problematic. People are meant to worship in a central location.
So that reminds me that there's significance, I believe, in your article about how they get into the land.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go into that? What is the significance about where their entry point is?
Oh, yeah, good question. So this does get us into discussion about the location of the Mount Ebal episode within Joshua. So there's a prescription in Deuteronomy 27 that whenever the Israelites cross over the Jordan, they are to build an altar of unhewn stones to Yahweh and then write upon it the law of Moses. So this doesn't happen immediately in the text of Joshua that we are used to reading, uh, which is normally patterned after the Masoretic text. That doesn't happen until Joshua chapter 8. But in the Qumran tradition, this begins, or the Mount Ebal altar episode takes place in chapter 5, pretty close to when the Israelites do cross over the Jordan. And so the location of the Mount Ebal episode in our Qumran text is actually more closely patterned after the prescription in Deuteronomy 27 than the MT and LXX locations. So it does something in sort of the imagination of the reader. If you have Deuteronomy 27 in mind as you're reading Joshua, the location in the Qumran text probably resonates a little more with Deuteronomy. If you have Deuteronomy 27 in mind as you're reading Joshua 8, or Joshua in the MT or LXX, you might be thinking in the back of your mind, well, where's the altar that is supposed to have been erected after they cross over the Jordan? So it functions differently within the narrative, particularly in its location in the MT. It functions in the MT not primarily as a fulfillment, I think, of Deuteronomy 27, or not just as a fulfillment of Deuteronomy 27, but as the the expected narrative fulfillment of narrated conquest. So it fulfills this pinnacle of narrated warfare, uh, the building of an inscribed monument, as we expect from our Neo-Assyrian inscriptions in some of our Levantine texts.
Okay, so that kind of goes into the motivation of why you're telling me, not you, but why the scribes are transmitting this particular story to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see things about location, you'll see things about where they tell the story in the larger story, right? And that helps generate an understanding of what their intent was.
Yeah, it's you can of course we can't ask scribes questions, but
Not
we
with that attitude.
now okay, now without necromancy. Just kidding. We shouldn't practice necromancy. Uh,
He just winked at me, listeners.
well, if we just think about if we think about the location of the episode, we have to sort of ask ourselves why it's positioned in three different locations. What does it do, or why is it important uh, to move around in three different locations? One that might speak to the late addition of the Ebal episode into the narrative of Joshua, um, but it at least should sort of raise our eyebrows. I think because it's an important event. It's an altar built to Yahweh, um, and it's inscribed with the Torah of Moses, and it is following after a prescription in Deuteronomy 27. So this is important for the sort of overarching narrative coherence of the biblical story. So why does it appear in three different locations? There have to be, I think, satisfying reasons for it to appear in different locations. But the different locations, I do think, uh, I think the different locations are positioned for different reasons. I don't think it's the same reason that governs each location. So we could discuss that maybe if you'd like a little bit.
Well, I do want, yes, one
Yeah, we'll
second,
hold
because
hold
I
the
am
horses.
curious. I am curious. Is it possible? I'm trying to remember exactly how you worded it. Is it possible that the reason is something that you and I would not find satisfactory?
It doesn't have to satisfy our modern literary sensibilities, but that's why I think drawing from uh, different ancient accounts is so helpful. So that's why the Neo-Assyrian warfare tradition and Levantine warfare traditions, I think, are so compelling for thinking about the earliest location of this Ebal episode.
Who was the first to identify this?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, so the conversations that I trace in the article go back to Eugene Ulrich's work with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then Kristen Detroyer's work with the LXX and MT traditions of Joshua. So I don't know who the earliest person was to discuss the location of this episode, um, but it seems like in what my research has uncovered is the two most important voices in the location of this episode have been Eugene Ulrich and Kristen Detroyer. There others have contributed to this conversation as well.
So I was more bringing that up just to be able to put a name. So Ulrich. So
Hmm.
you are essentially in dialogue with Ulrich and others, and
Yes.
there is a kind of a, you're circling around something that he and others were circling around, and you're trying to get a better vantage point or a better understanding, and maybe use what he did or reject what he did. I'm not saying you're rejecting it, but sometimes you will, right? Sometimes you'll
Hmm.
say, no, I think so and so was wrong for this reason, but you have the benefit of, well, someone else said this thing
Hmm.
before or after them, and so I get to build off of that. And that to me is the really cool part of what biblical
Oh
scholars
yeah.
do. Ancient
Hmm.
scholars in general, what you guys
Hmm.
do is just kind of circling around to understand people who were like us, but
Hmm.
also different from us.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's all of scholarship is entering into a conversation, especially biblical scholarship, entering into a 2,000-year ongoing conversation that has really ramped up in the last 200 years with interest. So, yeah, Eugene Ulrich and Christian Detroyer, brilliant scholars. I do end up taking a different position than either of them about the location of this episode, um, but by and large, I'm so indebted to Christian Detroyer's work on the Greek text of Joshua. I agree with almost everything else she says, except for the location of this one episode. So, uh, yeah, we can talk about that as well. But these are uh, to be sure, even though scholars disagree, and as a young scholar, trying to disagree respectfully with people that are my elders in the field. I'm just so indebted to all of their work. But this is how the conversation goes. Someone says something, here's the evidence they provide. Someone has a different position. Maybe they rework the evidence or look at the evidence from a different angle or raise different evidence that might be more compelling, which is, I hope, what I've done in this article. We'll see what other people say in 10 years.
Yeah. Oh, well, I hope you don't have to wait that long. Come on, it's not.
Yeah.
It's 16. It's 16 pages, guys. It shouldn't take you 10 years to read it and respond to it.
Who knows?
Uh, I'm throwing down the gauntlet for you. No.
Oh, okay.
Uh, so on the position of a story, I do, and
Mhm.
I've had people explain this to me, And I understand and I acknowledge like those are helpful explanations, but deep down in my gut, I have trouble understanding how could it be a good faith act to
Mm,
move something around in a sacred text.
yeah, that's a great question. Um, uh, Probably because at least how it seems in our text traditions of the Bible, ancient scribes probably had different conceptions of what was responsible, uh, and how to handle sacred texts, and also possibly because some of the texts that they're working with hadn't yet arrived at a so-called canonical position with, uh, within a community. They may have been religiously significant, but a form of the text hadn't yet taken such deep root in a community that it was no longer changeable. Um, but some reasons that people would make changes to texts. One is clarity of the text. Maybe a community has a sense of what they think the text is saying, and there's an aspect of the text as they've received it that's unclear to their context. So they make a change, like they'll add in a word, like "and this place stood till this day" or "stands until this day," just letting the audience know that we're talking about the same place here, even though the story took place 200 years ago or something. Another reason that you might make a change is that you think that repositioning a certain aspect of the text uh, is more faithful to another text. So this is part of the argument as to why the Mount Ebal text is later positioned in Joshua chapter 5 to make to make the narrative of Joshua cohere more closely with the command in Deuteronomy to build an altar just after you cross over the Jordan. Um, so I think both of those things are happening in our text traditions. One to try to make sense of the text, and one to try to make it cohere more closely with another scriptural text.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably a fuller answer than what I've gotten before. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, of course there are other reasons that people might make changes to texts. So this is a it's just a really complicated ongoing conversation about who makes what changes to texts and why. Um, Sarah Milstein has an excellent book called I think it's called "Tracking the Master Scribe." Uh, so it's a study about scribal communities and who's sort of licensed to make large changes to sacred texts. Yeah,
Oh, really?
very interesting stuff. Mm.
Yeah, I had not heard of that book. I, yeah, I'd love to get my hands on that. I know we put a pin in a couple of things, so I'm gonna, and I've lost the thread. So
Oh, no problem.
I'm gonna let you go off and
Yeah,
pick
okay.
up where I interrupted.
No problem. You've given no interruptions, just excellent probing questions. This has been great. Uh, this is a part of this is the a part of this conversation is the argument is rooted in ongoing conversations about the composition of Joshua or the composition of the historiographic books in general in the Old Testament and when they were written and by whom. So it raises a whole bunch of really interesting related questions that unfortunately I don't have a firm answer to, but I'm writing a dissertation on ritual texts in the Pentateuch. Those are things I need to have firm answers on. Um, so I think, maybe one thing to say about the argument of the article is that there is this Mount Ebal episode appears in different locations in the Masoretic text, in the Septuagint, and at Qumran, and I'm trying to make an argument about the earliest location. And I think the Masoretic text location is the earliest location that we have of the Mount Ebal episode. And that's because in Neo Assyrian inscriptions, narrated conquest ends with the installation of an inscribed image. And that's how I think the Mount Ebal altar episode functions in Joshua chapter 8. It's the conclusion of narrated warfare, and it's an expected conclusion. Uh, and I think that this is narratively and ritually very significant. It's not just that this is a common practice and it's kind of cool that you erect an inscribed image. It does something to community dynamics, and it stands as a marker for posterity of this conquest of Yahweh, and then also the instruction that Yahweh gave to Moses. So it unifies community. It is a marker for generations to look back on for the success that Yahweh has given His people. It does other ritual things as well, but that it loses that sort of essential function in the location of the Septuagint, in the location in the Qumran text. So in the Septuagint, after Joshua and the Israelites defeat Ai, there are two verses that come in between the Ai conquest in the Ebal episode. There's a coalition of kings that gather against Joshua, and then the Mount Ebal altar episode is narrated, and then there's an episode where the Gibeonites come to Joshua at Gilgal. So it's narratively it's really strange. It's a really awkward transition between all those episodes. Uh, so what others have said, what Christian Detroyer has said, for example, is that the LXX, the Septuagint, is the earliest location of this episode for a few reasons. One, because she thinks that the LXX of Joshua draws from a Hebrew tradition that predates the Masoretic text, which I think she's right about generally. And two, because the location of the Mount Ebal episode in our Septuagint tradition is what we might call the Lectio Difficilior, the most difficult reading. And in classic sort of new uh, um, text critical terms, the more difficult reading is likely the earliest reading. It's more likely that later scribes would try to smooth out some narrative discontinuity. So if something is narratively awkward, it might speak to a text's earlier location. So that's what Detroyer thinks. Uh, but then Ulrich has argued that the location of the episode in chapter 5 of Joshua uh, is the earliest because it corresponds most closely to Deuteronomy chapter 27. So all these arguments going on about the location of the text. Yeah, in quick summary, I guess, I think that the MT is the earliest location because it's the only location that satisfies the prescriptions of Deuteronomy chapter 27 and the narrative expectations set up by the beginning of by the rest of Joshua chapter 8, which is patterned after these Neo-Assyrian descriptions of warfare that all culminate in the ritual uh, building of an inscribed monument. Happy to discuss uh, Christian Detroyer's argument in more detail and some of the other things I do in the article as well. But that's a mouthful of material, and want to give some breathing room for the listeners.
So that had me wondering on behalf of the listeners, mainly for me, but maybe for them too, is do you so if I reach behind me and I grab the English translation of Joshua, right,
Mm-hmm.
and I pull that out and read it, does that appear smoother than these original language texts, whether they're Hebrew or Greek, that you have?
It's a good question. It would depend upon which translation, but most English translations follow the Masoretic text location of the Mount Ebal episode. So it's right after Joshua 1 or Joshua 8:29, and there's the episode. It'd be rare. I don't know of any English translation that follows the Septuagint location of that episode.
Well, I guess what I mean is, so like when you're reading,
Mm-hmm.
you have come to this conclusion, but I think you're acknowledging that there are still difficulties or awkwardness or I don't know how, like
Yeah.
there are a lot of words you could use to describe it when you're reading the original text. Do translators smooth that stuff out to where I
Oh,
won't notice it?
I see. Um, In certain locations, absolutely, translators smooth things out from Hebrew or Greek to make things more readable for English speakers. Uh, in Joshua 8, it doesn't seem to me that the Hebrew is so um, so strange that you would need to do that. It's pretty standard prose Hebrew, verb, subject, object, um, five consecutives in Hebrew guiding the narrative, and there's not a lot of uh, really strange or arcane vocabulary in Joshua chapter 8. So there doesn't seem to me to be a need to really take a lot of effort to smooth out the text of Joshua 8 for modern readers. It's really the location of the episode within traditions that makes it so weird, especially in the Septuagint. It's like I don't know. It's like you're reading a Harry Potter book or something, and Harry is going to Quidditch practice, and you get a whole story about how he's on his way down to the Quidditch pitch, and then there's two lines about how there are house elves in the kitchen that are preparing dinner for later, and then it goes back to the Quidditch game that that Harry's a part of, and then there's a narration about a big feast in the Great Hall or something. That's how the LXX reads. It's just a strange insertion between what seem to be pretty related episodes in the text.
If I'm honest, my motivation for asking that was largely that. So when I'll tell people, yeah, I know I have this Bible podcast. A lot of times their thoughts about what I talk about kind of skew toward conspiracy theory, and because we're talking about a disagreement between texts, a disagreement between scholars that is not, I know for a fact, represented in the Bibles that people are reading in the pew or at home,
Mm-hmm.
or when they go to Bible Gateway. I guess I just wanted to kind of, well, it's not a nudge anymore because I'm explicitly saying it. I wanted to just like disabuse people of the idea that whether it's you or Bible translators, someone's trying to pull a fast one on them.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're saying there are, so actually, and it sounds like you're with the Harry Potter analogy, you're referring to the textual conflict within the Goblet of Fire versions. Uh, that's the only one I can remember where there's house elves in the kitchen. But so, but that if that happened 20 years from now, when I get I get my copy from whatever, if texts were generated the way that they were in the ancient world, we would run into that. But because they're not, we don't. And in fact, an analogy I was going to use is I could take the PDF that I have of your article. I could copy it, paste it into Word. I can do all of this, and I can move things around if I
Mm-hmm.
want to. But you are the author. Well, it's not so clear in the ancient world, and I kind of think that's the ambiguity. So it's not a hard, set in stone, concrete. There must be a conspiracy. It's you're saying there's ambiguity, and we're just trying
Oh
to
yeah.
figure it out.
There is ambiguity, absolutely, and we're just trying to figure it out. Um, the I think the really complicated thing about a number of our text traditions of the Old Testament is they are drawing from a version of a text that we don't have anymore. So I don't. So what seems clear is that at one point in history there was a Greek translation or an effort to produce Greek translations of the Hebrew Old Testament. But the Hebrew text that those original Greek translators used is not necessarily the same as the Hebrew Masoretic text that we're mostly used to reading translations of in our Bible. So this also gives rise to some confusion. So it's not like our Greek traditions are straight translations of the Masoretic text. In many cases, that's demonstrably not the case. Uh, Take for example the Greek and Hebrew texts of Jeremiah in the MT and the LXX. But in this case, it does seem like the Greek text of Joshua is making use of a Hebrew text that predates the Masoretic text. So this adds to more confusion. So it's not clear that the Masoretic text was using the same Hebrew version that the Greek translators used in the 200s or so when they were translating. So, yeah, we're talking about hypothetical reconstructions of texts in some cases that we just don't have access to anymore, and it's very complicated. Um, so people are rightly confused and troubled by some of these text traditions, but they're for scholars they're just very interesting, trying to make sense of all these details. But for those of us that come from faith traditions, they can be troubling to some of our preconceptions of what the text of the Bible is.
When at what point in your education did you start to get access to the level of texts that you deal with regularly now?
Hmm. I was lucky to have uh, um, really good instructors as an undergraduate. Uh, at first, I was very interested in the New Testament and early Christianity, and one of my professors in an advanced Greek class had us read texts from Maximus the Confessor and other Greek texts that are in this sort of online database called the Thesaurus Lingua Greca. It's this sort of like database of all these ancient Greek texts. And so, from an undergraduate, my professors urged me to deal with primary texts and different text traditions that are helpful for interpreting the New Testament. And then when I did my master's degrees, I was also lucky to have excellent instructors that encouraged me to interact with primary sources in their original languages. And after that, it's just a matter of tracking down all of this stuff. Where do you get access to different Greek versions of Joshua or different Hebrew versions of Joshua? And it's an effort really to find uh, texts of Akkadian texts. You go to some of these classical editions that I drew from this article written by Kirk Grayson in this sort of um, what is it called, the royal inscriptions of the Neo-Assyrian period. So you just have to, after you sort of gain sort of facility in the original languages, now then it's all about finding reliable editions of these ancient texts, which for this paper I only was able to do the last 2 years or so, um, during this Joshua seminar that I was a part of.
Okay.
Mhm.
I mean, I think just again the concept that people may have in their heads is if you remember reading a Sports Illustrated article about Craig Biggio back in 1996, you can probably go online and find that with minimal difficulty.
Mhm.
Whereas you're saying, now I know the languages, I know these texts exist, I have to find some way to get access to it. And I'll say this: at least it's, since we're doing a fantasy thing, at least you're not like Gandalf and you're like, sitting in some dungeon somewhere, uh, surrounded by scrolls,
Mhm.
and that's the only way you can get access to them.
Yeah. Well,
But
luckily, a lot of people have done all of the Gandalf work already, have going into ancient libraries or transcribing tablets. Um, for biblical sources, we have a wealth of material, especially available in English now. We've got translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Old Testament Dead Sea Scrolls. We've got a translation of the Septuagint or versions of the Greek texts of the Old Testament, and so those are available to interested readers. The challenge is finding finding copies of the actual Greek in Hebrew texts, which for the most part, as a Bible scholar, I have pretty easy access to. But it's when I dip outside of my primary field into Neo-Assyrian texts that it just takes me hours to locate uh, primary reconstructions of some of these texts.
and this is why people should encourage their children to go into the humanities, so that there's more resources in it.
Mhm.
Is that it's not a
Right.
joke. I know I've
No.
made other jokes, but I think you and I can both agree on that. Liberal
No.
arts education is not a bad thing and it's not a waste of resources. That
No,
is the official
absolutely
position of
not.
this podcast.
It's a good official position.
Yeah. As a history major, yeah, I feel like I'm not going out on a limb there.
No.
Is there anything, look, I know that I followed a whole bunch of different rabbits off in a lot of different directions. Is there anything in the article that I didn't ask about that you were hoping I would?
The article is sort of constructed in three parts. One is what are the various locations of the Mount Ebal episode in our Greek and Hebrew text traditions. Two is examining the narrative pattern of Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions narrating warfare. And then the third is about the ritual function of inscribed installations. And what I do in that third section about the ritual function of these inscribed monumental inscriptions is I try to emphasize that this isn't just part of a cool narrative style, or it's not just that an inscribed monument uh, is a fitting conclusion to a narrative. The construction of an inscribed monument actually does something socially through sort of a ritual practice. It creates social dynamics and categorizes people into social hierarchies. In an ancient world, those include the deity, the king, anybody who was involved in building the inscribed monument, and then all those that were there to witness it at the moment of installation, and then those that would see it in years past. So the the building of an inscribed monument really reinforces national identity under a certain deity, under the leadership of a human leader, and then it reinforces the social cohesion among the people. So it's it's something more than just a neat thing that ends the narrative, which is why I think the MT location is such a compelling early location. That's you don't get the same thing in the Greek tradition or in the Qumran tradition. Something different is happening that really takes the Mount Ebal altar episode away from this. I think early fundamental position at the end of the icon quest. Um, so that's I think one thing that I would emphasize about the article. Uh, the other thing we don't think we've chatted about is why somebody would have relocated the art or the episode just two verses later in the Septuagint. So um, in the MT version, there is sort of a narrative difficulty, which is so there's a conquest of Ai that takes place at the city Ai, and then all of a sudden Joshua and the Israelites are at Mount Ebal in Mount Gerizim in Shechem, which is a little bit northeast of Ai, and then immediately afterwards they're in Gilgal, which is at a different location. So how in the world are they how in the world are they traversing the region so quickly? I think this is what the Greek version of Joshua attempts to solve. So there's a conquest of Ai, and then in two verses there's this brief narrative reprieve or interruption where there's a coalition of kings that gather against Joshua. And as a reader, I think that gives you time to kind of imagine that Joshua and the Israelites have then moved from Ai to a different location. So it's not so abrupt that they have this ritual taking place at Mount Ebal. There's been a narrative interim, and then you have you have this brief narrative about the Gibeonites gathering, at which time then Joshua and the Israelites have made their way to Gilgal. So I think that the Greek tradition solves a problem of what a scribe thought of as a sort of as a narrative difficulty because of historical geography. So they weren't as concerned, I think, about the relationship of the Mount Ebal altar episode to the preceding conquest. They were concerned about, does this narrative make sense functionally? How could they have gotten to so many places so quickly? So that's what I posited as a reason for the narrative awkwardness of the Septuagint. I think that's a, a point that people would really would have some issues with, just because it's just a suggestion. It just explains why somebody would do that, but we have no positive evidence within the text that indicates this is why the episode was moved. It just makes sense of the variables to me.
So, I know that second point is one that I wouldn't bump on unless I had a map in front of me
Yeah.
and I'm just back and forth the whole time. And on the first one, so uh, are the equivalents here roughly that like so there's this victory and there's a cultic rallying around the divine present or the divinity
Mhm.
and the king. Is that then the divine or the divinity and Moses in this case?
Oh, good question. It would be in Joshua. It would be Yahweh and Joshua. So Joshua is the leader of the people, and Yahweh is the deity under the deity that they follow. But then Moses does also make his way into the narrative indirectly, because what's inscribed on the altar is the Torah of Moses, and so that does I think a number of things too. It signals Joshua as as a leader who is acting in line with Mosaic prescriptions, and it sort of solidifies him as the military and possibly ritual leader of the Israelites, who has erected this altar for Yahweh at the close of a battle. Um, and then, of course, it's the concluding of the text is that the people did all that was that all they did all that was commanded um, in the Torah of Moses. And so this isn't just something that Joshua has done; it's that all of the people have done. So it's sort of a three-tiered hierarchical system that's cemented in this ritual.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you. That makes sense. Where would you send people? Are there books, blogs, podcasts, YouTube, whatever that you would send people to get a better understanding of what you study?
There's so many things to read, and nobody has time to read everything. So uh, that's how I feel. Some things that were really helpful for me in this article. There are two articles written by Nathaniel Lev-Tow. One of them in particular is an article called "Monumental Inscriptions in the Ritual Representation of War." This is where he discusses the significance of inscribed monuments after war or after narrated warfare. Um, so that was really helpful for me understanding maybe the impulse for building inscribed monuments in the Neo-Assyrian tradition was a book by Mario Liverani called Assyria: The Imperial Mission. And then there's a fantastic article by Lionel Marty called Inscriptions and Ritual Practices in the Neo-Assyrian Period. It's in this collected volume called I think it's called Ritual Texts in the Pentateuch, edited by Christoph Niehan and Julia Ryder. Just a really excellent collection of essays that talk about the relationship between ritual practice and ritual texts and the different evidences that we have for that relationship. So I think that's where I would send people. Maybe that edited volume by Nihan and Ryder is a great place for people to start. All of this article included a number of things that I'm just so interested in: ritual theory, textual criticism, compositional models of biblical books, and then the sort of place of biblical text traditions within text traditions of the ancient Near East more broadly. So I have wide ranging interests in lots of recommendations. I think. Do you think that will satisfy listeners? Those three recommendations.
I mean, if they want more, they can just hit you up.
That's true. Hit me up.
Yeah. Um,
Kyle underscore Rouse 1 at Baylor.edu. Here we
wow.
go.
I think that's the first time anybody's thrown their email in there on the audio.
Uh oh. Maybe
What
that's
do
not
you?
so
No,
good.
it's fine. What What do you read for fun?
Oh, every Christmas I read the Harry Potter series. So that Harry Potter illustration, it wasn't an accident that I have that material at the tip of my tongue. So in the next few weeks, I'll start on the Sorcerer's Stone and make my way through the Deathly Hallows. So I do that almost every year. Um, I just finished this summer the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown, which I didn't expect to enjoy, but I really did. Let's see, what else do I read for fun? That's about it right now. I started reading Dune, or I read Dune this summer, and I started to read the next in the series. I think it's Dune Messiah, and it just did not capture my attention the way that the first Frank Herbert book did. So, but I've heard that's how it goes. I've heard you got to make it through Dune Messiah, and uh, then it gets better. So we'll see if I ever make it through the Dune series.
I mean, if there's anything I love, it's reading that's a chore. I will say I have never heard anyone give a bad review of the Red Rising series. I haven't read them.
Oh
I
yeah.
think I have the first one.
Oh
I
cool.
haven't started it yet, but for years, a friend of mine has been telling me. Actually, she's listening. I'm sorry, I haven't listened to it, but for years, she's been telling me to read the Red Rising books. Uh,
Yeah.
and then Dune is the opposite, where someone was recommending it to me, and he was like, "It gets really difficult," and I was like, "What? What? I'm bad enough at reading as it is. I lose focus. I'm slow. I just like no. You tell that's a terrible review. So if you didn't
Mhm.
want me to read it, not you, but my
Uh,
friend, if you don't want me to read it, then tell me it's a tough trek."
I loved I'd never read a book like Dune, where so Frank Herbert uh, will give you insight to like all of the characters. So all the main characters have this internal dialogue, and he represents it in italics in the text, and so it's really neat because you don't just get a narrative centered on Paul Atreides at the beginning. You get this cluster of people that all have thoughts about the narrative progression, but also Paul as a character, and that's where in the internal thoughts is where you get the sort of subtle casting of his character. As in the beginning of the book, you expect him to be, uh, I think, a well received messiah figure, but it's this internal dialogue that Frank Herbert creates with all the characters where you start to see that Paul is a problematic character, and even though his intentions, at least at the beginning, are for the benefit of the Fremen, he's in the middle of uh, these just massive powers that he won't be able to control, and so even a well-intentioned messiah figure brings death to yeah to the Fremen and to the rest of the world. So I think it's a really well written book, which probably seems obvious to people who are a fan of Frank Herbert. Um, but the Red Rising series, it does take about 100 pages to really get into the story. So if you can make it through those 100 pages, I think you're good. Then it'll really capture you.
Okay, noted. I will pull that one off the shelf at some point. Kyle
Yeah.
Rouse, thank you for sitting down with me. Do you have any? Is that? Are we good?
We're good, Jared. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. You're yeah, for your listeners, Jared's a great host. This has been a really friendly conversation, and yeah, I've really enjoyed talking about a bunch of things related to the article, and then also non-related to the article, like books that I am interested in, and things just in broader biblical studies. It's a really fun conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, man. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com with any feedback or guest suggestions, or if you just want to angrily rant at me about things that aren't related to the podcast. I'd love to hear from you. You can also support the podcast materially by going to the Patreon link that'll be in the show notes, and it's also in my bio on all social media platforms. Also, I'd love to I'd love to have follows over on whatever social media platforms you prefer. If you don't find me on that one, let me know, and I'll do a better job of getting out there, but I should be on all of them. Here's a quick preview of next week's conversation with Amber Dillon on her doctoral thesis, The Archetypal Witness, John the Baptist, and Composite Intertextuality in the Fourth Gospel. Thanks and take care.
I think we need to recover a little bit, and not just in academia, because again, academia is kind of figuring this out. They're going back and forth in these conversations. I'm not necessarily speaking just about academia, but even at just like a normal everyday level, we need to retrieve a little bit of how Jewish this gospel writer really was, I think. And of course, because it's got such developed, Christian theology or even Christology of the person and work of Christ, Christian traditions employ the Gospel of John. The Anglican tradition has so much Gospel of John language just in the liturgy that they do every week, because the gospel is super, quote, Christian, and so it is very easy, I think, and part of what I aim to do is retrieve a little bit of how Jewish I think the author's use of scripture really is, that he's not offering this crazy different interpretation. Now, for some it would be different, but he's offering, as Christopher Blumenhofer puts it, a solution to the epistemological crisis that the people of God were facing, and that he's saying Jesus is the way forward with the challenges that are being faced. Because Judaism in the first century is not monolithic. Any group of people, right, is not all that. We can't speak of everybody is or everybody thinks, and ever really. So when we speak about it, it's almost like John within Judaism is already kind of a weird thing to say, because there wasn't one brand or one version or one what's the word, expression of what it meant to be a Jewish person in the first century. And so even just thinking like that does two things. It helps remind us that we can't pigeonhole the evangelist too much and what he is or isn't doing. But it also suggests, as I kind of do, that the evangelist is just one of many Jewish writers who's speaking of the Jewish scriptures. My second chapter goes into the use of Jewish scripture in Second Temple literature, or some of the contemporary literature at that time, and seeing how the evangelist is employing scripture kind of similarly to these other authors. Now, obviously, he's coming to different conclusions. He's not saying the same things they're saying necessarily, but he's using it the same way, and he's offering an alternative engagement with the scriptures as they're pointing to Jesus. And so by remembering those things and remembering the Jewish context, or what I would argue is the Jewish context of the evangelist in the fourth gospel, by engaging that, we can begin to make a little bit more sense of how these symbols and scriptures are being employed, and then how we are to understand them. And that's half of, and again, like the question you asked earlier, that's half of the conversation of the nature of the gospel, because then there's always the hoi daioi points that we see later. But again, it's ambiguous and it's diverse. There's really not, you can't really pigeonhole the use of hoi daioi either in the gospel, because they do lots of things. Sometimes they respond well to Jesus, and sometimes they don't. And then Jesus says something really harsh and intense. You're like, whoa, ugh, like God's kind of bitter. And so that's, it's not even clear there either. And I think we need to resist simplistic interpretations in the fourth gospel. It's funny that you said earlier that, someone said to, start with the Gospel of John. And I was told that by someone when I was in high school, like, oh, you need to read the Gospel of John first in the Bible. And I see it, because it's elevates Jesus so much. And usually it's Christians who are saying to do this. I don't say this. I love the Gospel of John, but my thought is read the Old Testament first. You absolutely need the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. You need that understanding, especially again, if allusions are how the evangelist wants us to read scripture in his gospel, then we need to know where those allusions are coming from. And they're coming from the text of the Jewish scriptures. So yeah, and it is a very Christian, quote, Christian text, in that it really elevates Christ. But I think the foundation for that elevation is the Jewish scriptures, Jewish tradition and Jewish understanding. Not as a rejection of it, but as a realization of it, that Jesus is continuing forward the story of the people of God. And that really does help us understand a little bit more an approach to the text that's there.